When Edgar Cayce spoke of the Essenes, was he speaking from the Akashic Records or from the collective consciousness of the early 1900s? Hey guys, it's John sitting here in my studio with a big giant mug of water. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. He spoke of the Essenes years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were ever discovered. When he spoke of the Dead Sea Scrolls, he didn't attribute them to the Essenes. He said scrolls would be found near the Dead Sea. The mentions that he made of the Essenes were steeped in a bunch of different ideologies. Remember that Edgar Cayce was literally coming from a Christian background. He was not part of the early theosophical movement, or was he? He said his information was coming from the Akashic Records. Well, the term Akashic Records comes from the Theosophical Society. Akasha meaning the wisdom of the universe, right? The Theosophical Society was trying to marry Hinduism with Christianity, and the Akasha comes from Hinduism. This idea of the Akashic Records was something the Theosophical Society was pushing in the early 1900s. So Cayce, coming from his Christian background, must have been very much steeped in this idea of the Theosophical Society, because the Akashic Records was never mentioned until the Theosophical Society started teaching it. Now, was he channeling the collective consciousness, or was he just tapping into the social constructs of the time period? So I want to share the story of the Da Vinci Code. Prior to the Da Vinci Code was the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Prior to that book was the documented fraud of Pierre Plantard. Pierre Plantard created historical documents, created them, falsified them, and put them into church libraries in Paris. What was his goal for this? His goal was to prove that he was the bloodline of Jesus. So the whole story of Mary Magdalene coming to France and having children and carrying on the bloodline of Jesus all stems from Pierre Plantard. Now, why do we know what he was talking about was a fraud? Because the police raided his house and found the evidence that he was creating the fake documents. And when the scholars look at the documents, they're not even written in the correct language of the periods, and they reference modern New Age ideas. So we know that Pierre Plantard was a fraud. And why do we know that? Because he confessed. He actually confessed, and then he lived his life out in shame after that, right? Because he was caught faking himself being the bloodline of Jesus. He created a group called the Priory of Sion, which had no historical basis in anything other than this idea that he was creating a spiritual group. Well, as the leader of the group, he kept trying to push himself up into this egomaniacal idea that he was the bloodline of Jesus, and then he started creating evidence of it, and he got caught, basically. Well, the Holy Blood, Holy Grail book came out based upon that. They believed he was true, right? But he had already admitted that it was a fraud. Dan Brown found Holy Blood, Holy Grail, wrote the book Da Vinci Code, which became the movie. Soon thereafter, Da Vinci Code came out. Psychic mediums and channelers started talking about her being Mary Magdalene going to France. The collective consciousness started talking about this idea, and they started to create narratives around this truth. But this truth was known to be a fraud. It was actually exposed. And so what that tells us is that the collective consciousness affects readings. It affects the readings of people of the time. Edgar Cayce was known as the sleeping prophet, known for his trance readings somewhere between 1900 and 1945. And he described the scenes as a spiritual brotherhood preparing the way for Jesus, training Mary, and preserving ancient wisdom. Okay, so when you look at this, there's a lot in this that's interesting, because if you read the Bible, you'll very quickly understand that Jeshua never claimed to be the Messiah. He never claimed to be anything more than you. He washed his disciples' feet to prove that he was no better than they. This idea that he was the Messiah is something that comes from Paul, not Jeshua. But Cayce, being a devout Christian, this was his theology. This was his belief, right? Now okay, Jeshua was the Messiah. Well, the word Messiah means Meshiach, which means king or ruler. It had nothing to do with spirituality in the time. That's a later addition to the construct of the word Messiah. Meshiach literally meant a ruling king that would come in to save his people or her people, his people in the time, it was a patriarchal time. This idea of this preserving ancient wisdom is a modern New Age conspiracy. They're saying you didn't know something and this is the secret thing. But this is what the Theosophical Society did. They tried to prove that Jeshua was teaching Hinduism. And they're trying to prove that this is what he did. But the real problem is that 1900 and 1945 is what I just said about Cayce's teachings. Madame Blavatsky started the Theosophical Society in the late 1800s. So by the time Cayce started predicting these Essene things, the Theosophical Society was already talking about it. They were actually trying to prove this mystical idea of Hinduism within Christianity. And they kept putting it out there into the consciousness, just like Dan Brown put out this idea that Mary went to France. But were these unique revelations or echoes of cultural imagination of his time? People will often have near-death experiences who aren't Christian, but they'll see Christian imagery. But we live in a society that's filled with Christian imagery. You drive down the road and you're going to see a bumper sticker that says John 3:16 on it, right? You're going to drive down the road or go to work and somebody's going to sneeze. You're going to say, God bless you. That's a Christian reaction. This is in the subconscious mind. This is in the culture. And now a quick word from our sponsor. Coffee Time with John. This channel runs off coffee, so get your coffee and tea at johnsjoe.com. Cayce himself was deep into Christianity, so his readings are all coming from the framework of Christianity and the social constructs of the time, where the Theosophical Society was teaching this idea that he was an Essene and a vegetarian and all these things with no evidence at all. Madame Blavatsky, who started the Theosophical Society, when she made her list of all she'd done in her life, there is no physical way she could have done everything she said she did. She supposedly studied with secret teachers in the mountains of the Himalayas and secret teachers in the Americas with the Native Americans. And she traveled the world and she spent years with each of these groups. It doesn't lay out with her actual history. She was a seance reader who did all of her readings in the nude, and she created this idea of the Theosophical Society. The Essenes, Cayce claimed that they were this disciplined mystical community preparing for the Messiah. Absolutely, probably true. They were a disciplined community who were teaching Judaism. Why do we know that? Because the only documented writings that are attributed to the Essenes, and I say attributed because it's not proven that there are Essene writings, is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were only about the Torah. The Judaic faith had nothing to do with Christianity, had nothing to do with Hinduism. They were 100% based in the Torah. The idea that Mary was chosen and trained by the Essenes for bearing Jesus is this idea that Jeshua was preordained to be this Messiah, which is not what Jeshua taught. At the time of the late 1800s, early 1900s, the women's movement was on rise. The suffragettes and all were in there. So Cayce talked about women as equals in their order and strict diets and spiritual training. None of that's documented anywhere else but in Cayce's readings. And if you take Cayce as 100% infallible, then you're making the same mistake that religions make about their Bibles and their Qurans. Right? They're all flawed. Cayce claimed that the Essenes were connected back to Melchizedek and early prophetic lines, and he was literally creating this narrative that was already in the constructs of society through the Theosophical Society. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were found, he had the only reference he made to the Dead Sea Scrolls is that scrolls would be found near the Dead Sea. That's all he said. But the collective consciousness of the early 1900s had this esoteric climate of theosophy, spiritualism, New Thought, the Rosicrucians teaching about hidden masters and mystery schools. Scholars and mystics were already speculating that the Essenes were secret keepers of wisdom. This was in the society. People were talking about these things. Of course, it's going to affect the readers of the time, just like Dan Brown affected the readers of our time. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a symbolic reservoir shared by humanity. Well, that symbolic reservoir that's shared by humanity is filled with belief, all kinds of beliefs. But until you start to look at these beliefs from the construct of, is it provable or is it just daydream? Is it this idea that we've chosen a belief and that belief is now the truth, period? Edgar Cayce may not have been copying anyone, but his visions echoed themes circulating in the cultural imagination. He was literally, his readings were bringing out the society's beliefs of the time. But none of it is provable. None of it is in any way, shape, or form historical. It's all coming out of readings, and readings are always brought through the belief of the reader. So did Cayce reflect theosophical ideas? Well, Theosophy spoke of hidden brotherhoods, reincarnation, ancient wisdom schools, and Cayce used Christian language and biblical reference, but his Essene stories sound similar to the theosophical teachings. They literally tie into the theosophical teachings, which the majority of the theosophical teachings have been proven to be false. The important distinction is that Cayce was not a Theosophical Society person. He was a devout Christian who wrestled with his own readings. But he was bringing things through that were in the collective consciousness, that were in the society of the time, the spiritual movement. His writings were very Christianized in their expression of broader esoteric ideas. But the Akashic Records, that term itself comes from the Theosophical Society. The collective consciousness is what Jung would talk about, but the idea that Cayce was tapping into these Akashic records, which is a universal memory field of all time. If there is an Akashic records or a collective consciousness, which I believe there probably is a collective consciousness, but when I look at it from the perspective of, if that's true, then everybody's beliefs are in there. Modern psychology might frame this as turning into a collective psyche of the time, as opposed to a truth. When someone starts to saying it's the truth, then they are negating that there are many truths, and truth is subjective. Either way, the visions reflected a truth larger than himself in his mind. He was bringing out things that were against his Christian teachings, and he wrestled with that idea. So what do you take away from this video is that the messenger is always filtered by the age they live in and the beliefs that they carry. Cayce's Essene teachings were groundbreaking, but also very much a product of the social ideology of the time. Whether it came from the Akashic Records or the collective consciousness, people dived into this idea of Cayce's work and have began seeking. Right? Well, Jeshua didn't ask you to seek; he asked you to be in the present, be now, and be love. And the being in the collective consciousness of documentation that is not historically valid is going to lead you into the wilderness seeking. But when you believe you are seeking, you will forever seek. And when you believe you are being love in the now, then you are following the way of Jeshua. We find our truth in this collective consciousness. We hear things and it feels right to us. Cayce was literally reciting the words of the time. He was literally bringing out theosophical teachings and ideologies, which is why he called it the Akashic Records. And he was taking those ideas and struggling with how they were in conflict with his Christianity. And so what did he do in his own mind? He married them. Now, can you find great truth in Cayce's work? Of course. You can find great truth everywhere. I find great truth in Star Wars movies. I find great truth in the words of a child. Truth can be found everywhere, and truth is always subjective. But when you have a group of people who are starting to promote something because they just say it to be so, it can affect a lot of things. And what happens is these ideas about vegetarianism and him being in a scene and all these things, they are affecting people in negative ways, in my opinion, because they're not talking about being here now. They're talking about the things you have to do to reach something ahead of you. They're putting the carrot on the stick for you to follow. But the carrot is right here. Drop the stick and eat the meal right here, right now. And that's my thought on this. You guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. See ya. Bye.